Well, hello and welcome. I'm AJ O'Neill. I'm a software engineer. I make six figures typing on a keyboard. I'm 100% convinced that you can do the same, and on this channel, I'm going to show you how. Yesterday, I talked about how Python needs to be the first language that you learn, and that you actually need to learn 3 languages to become proficient as a software engineer. The comments and questions that I got in response to that were about what are the different languages, why would I pick one over the other, and where do I start? Now, because this is such a broad topic and there's so many places that we could go, I'm going to limit this discussion to just 2 things. So first, prioritizing your learning based on the economic value of languages. And second, I'm just going to go through and cherry pick a few to tell you about them, which ones to possibly pay attention to and which ones to probably ignore. And if at any time you have that aha moment where you found that this video has been useful for you, go ahead and give it a like and consider subscribing because you might want to see the future videos as well. So the first thing that I want to draw to your attention is the paradox that's in front of us. When you look at the top third of this bar graph, you see, well, that's where all the bars and the high percentages are. That's where my focus should be. And this is wrong. Because at the top part of the graph here, what we have are jobs that are high availability, or the type of jobs that I would say are the jobs where you go to get paid to learn. They're not the jobs where you go to have a career and become an expert. Now, there's some exception to that. There are people that are expert at JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. There are people who are expert at SQL, and those people get paid accordingly. However, the mid-range is a really tough spot to be, so you're a lot better starting to focus down in the lower third where it's easier to be an expert and then go back once you've achieved results in the authority that commands the salary that you would want and one of these other languages at the top. Now, the ones on the bottom are typically what I'm going to call high demand languages, meaning that you're not going to find these types of jobs in places like Craigslist, and the people that are looking for someone to fill these roles are willing to pay for it. So my general advice is to have an eye on one of the things at the top of the list, but have your eye on 2 things at the bottom of the list. Learn just enough vocabulary that if you happen to get a job interview where there's something in that bottom half going on, that you can bring that up and you're going to sound 10 times more intelligent than if you just come in with what you are most skilled at. Part 2. Now we're going to go through and cherry pick these a little bit. JavaScript is a language that almost certainly you will need to learn to some degree, but I recommend saving it for later because it's kind of like the America of languages, a big melting pot where everybody's had their hand in and everything is just a hodgepodge of... It's a dumpster fire. The original language, which has now been dubbed Vanilla.js, was relatively simple to learn, but as it was driven by a committee, it became more and more complicated and convoluted, and now it's really, really difficult to get a good start. HTML and CSS are not programming languages because you can't use them to do something like add 1 plus 1 to get 2. SQL is something where you could choose to specialize and it can have great returns. Most people only know SQL a little bit, but it's easy to distinguish between someone who's mediocre and great, which is something that's more difficult in the JavaScript, HTML, CSS, Python, Java, Shell, C#, PHP arena. Now, Java is a language that specifically I'm going to say to avoid. If you want the skills that Java will give you, learn C# instead. It's a more pleasant language. You'll work mostly on Windows platforms. Other than that, there are lots of languages that are built on top of Java. They don't necessarily look like Java, but they're interesting and they're down in this lower half here, such as Scala and Clojure. Scripting is something that you're going to need to learn to do to be effective, and it will set you apart because most people don't bother to learn, but it's one of those 10x things that just makes you better than everyone else. PHP and C++ are languages typically to avoid because they don't even really provide you with a good on-ramp into something better. In the case of C++, it could kind of take you towards Rust, but C++ is just a complicated version of C. And if you wanted that, I'd say go with Rust, which is the nice complicated version of C as opposed to the ugly one. Typescript is one of those things that's in the JavaScript category where I'd say hold off and learn something else first because it's just a whole ball of wax. C is kind of interesting to learn because it puts you at bare metal with the computer, but again, I think you probably can do better off by learning that later, but it is something that at some period in your career you should dabble in because it's going to give you experience that gives you more context, and context makes you a superior engineer. Ruby is something that's more on the falling end of its curve, so I would say ignore this one. What Ruby brought to the community was test-driven development, behavior-driven development, REST APIs, etc. But all of these things have been replicated in other languages. You could certainly end up at a job where they have Ruby code and are actively developing new things, but I think that's a bad idea because there's nothing unique about the language other than being academic, which it's great, but not productive for a business. Go is absolutely one of the best languages you can learn. I'll talk more about that later, but it's incredibly pragmatic. It has basically the trifecta of everything that you'd want a language to be able to have in terms of the community support, the company support, a figurehead that's driving it, not crazy, it's not going to end up a dumpster fire. Assembly is something that you probably don't need to bother learning at this point, but if you already have an interest in microcontrollers, assembly is machine code, and that's something that will come in handy to you. Swift is what you use for iOS apps. Kotlin is another one of the Java languages, probably worth looking into. R, Python, and MATLAB are all specialized for statistics, which gets lumped in with machine learning, and most of it's not as magical as it sounds, but it can pay well for that reason. VBA is another thing that's kind of on the out. It's been replaced with JavaScript, I think, in much of the Office suite, but it's something mostly used by IT people, maybe accountants and other people that basically do Excel or other Microsoft Office applications for a living. Objective-C has been replaced by Swift. Some people still love it, but I think that one's on the out. Rust and Dart are both on the up. Rust is a good one to keep your eye on, but it takes a lot of skill to master. Dart almost fell completely off the charts, but because of a mobile framework called Flutter, which I've got a good feeling about, I see that it's coming back up, and I think that might be a trend that continues. I'm not ruling that one out. It's a little riskier, worth keeping your eye on. Elixir I've got a better feeling about than Clojure. I think this one too is on the rise. It's based on Erlang, which when Node.js, Go, and Erlang were all competing about 7 years ago to see which one was going to become the predominant web platform, Node won out, but Erlang has come and gone many times throughout the years. I don't think we've seen the last of it, and I think it's something that might be worth becoming an expert in. WebAssembly is something else that I think is on the rise. It's kind of a replacement for JavaScript, and if you're going to learn WebAssembly, you're also going to want to learn Rust. Now, most of these languages are C-style languages. The ones that are going to broaden your horizons the most are going to be ones like Rust, Elixir, Go, Ruby, and Python, and I'd certainly have to throw R in there as well. Now, you'll notice I just mentioned some of the languages that I told you to ignore, but this is about you're going to need to learn 3 languages, and you want them to be of different types. So even if it's not a language that is on the up and up, the fact that it exposes you to a different way of thinking is going to make you effective in every language that you use. For example, while I was learning JavaScript, I was also learning C. The two went hand in hand in my brain as to how I started to write programs. When I got my full-time job in Go, I also started learning Rust, and it made me a better Go developer because of it. So once I figure out a better way to kind of organize and tease these things apart, because there's just so much to unpack here, I'll do another video. Keep asking me questions, and I'll see you around. Adios.